You know, we talk quite a lot about the Japanese takeover and utter domination of the worldwide motorcycle industry, which included bringing down the biggest and best part of the industry from the 60s and 50s and prior, and that is the great companies from Britain. But I feel like the most overlooked aspect of this part of motorcycle history is really how these companies were even in a position to take on the world, and the way that these companies defeated the competition coming from within, that is from Japan. You know, we think that Suzuki and Yamaha and Kawasaki and of course Honda, we often view it as though they just sort of showed up one day taking on the world, and that's just not how it went. There's a whole story of how these companies came out on top in Japan. Now, the early formation of Japanese motorcycles essentially mimics that of the rest of the world, though about 10 years behind or so. Much of the very early Japanese motorcycle history is shrouded in mystery. We know that early bikes from the likes of Triumph were being imported as early as 1907, and then in 1908, the first motorcycle engine to be built in Japan was strapped to a frame, probably one of those Triumph frames. And again, though there's little known about these motorcycles, we do know that these things were happening. Though few riders outside of Japan had ever even heard of a Japanese-built motorcycle prior to World War II, 1913 actually marks the first year a complete Japanese motorcycle was built. This would also be the first year that motorcycles, again, Japanese engines mainly strapped to Triumph frames, would be separate from bicycles in two-wheeled racing in Japan. It's pretty interesting and rather humorous that early bicycle racing actually included motorcycles, a sort of race between man and machine to see who is faster. Motorcycles were so slow at first that they weren't really competitive in terms of speed with a person pedaling a bicycle, so the goal was to make a motorcycle that could outrun a guy on a bike. Now, the first complete made-in-Japan model was produced under the name Asahi by a firm called Miyata. Miyata was known for making bicycles at this time, and this model closely resembled, a Triumph of its time. But it was a two-stroke, and it made 3.5 horsepower. Sadly, young riders at this time were much more intrigued by the products coming out of the West, and they would choose to import bikes from Great Britain rather than supporting Miyata's endeavors. A good example would be to look at, say, a 1914 500cc Triumph, still, running and present in Japan. That bike made 4 horsepower, but it's really not bad. It was just more sophisticated in every way than anything that Japan had to offer at this point. Just a few years later, Miyata would give up on making in-house motorcycles. The country was already falling behind and just falling further behind at this point, and it looked as though Japan would just stay one of those countries that never produced its own motorcycles. Large American motorcycles started to be imported around this time as well, primarily for racing, but quickly these became the most popular bikes, not only for racing but also just regular riders. Into the early 20s, more competition from smaller British motorcycle manufacturers like Triumph and Norton were back on top as the primary imports to Japanese riders. 1923 marks the second attempt from a major Japanese company to build in-house motorcycles, and this was Meguro, a company that at that time was known for making gears. They really had a solid understanding of metals and what it would take to build a motorcycle. Early on, these few companies, they were really just experimenting with motorcycles. There were no major sales happening yet, but as motorcycle racing started to take over the Japanese public, it became clear to many companies that competitive in-house motorcycles could really be profitable in this environment. Racing really was the heart of motorcycle culture in Japan through the 20s and 30s, and it's the sport's popularity that would push some of the oncoming innovation. Dirt track and dirt road races would draw in crowds of over 30,000 people. In terms of racing, there are many legendary but likely unknown racers who really helped to build the landscape and a desire for performance motorcycles, names like Yoshisaburo Matsumoto and Seijiro Osada, as well as the incredibly successful female racer Miss Ayako Nishino. In response to the thriving racing and riding culture, Miyata decided to come back with another attempt at their own motorcycle. This time, it was a 175cc two-stroke single. That bike proved popular among Japanese riders. Sure, it was nothing compared to the big sporting machines from Britain and America, but quickly Miyata found themselves producing a solid number of motorcycles per year, nothing compared to the big companies from the West But by the beginning of World War II, Miata would make a total of about 3,000 bikes. But the big story from the early 1930s came from a partnership between Harley and the newly formed Rakuo Internal Combustion Company. Basically, Harley licensed the company to make a copy of their 750s, and Rakuo would go on to build these in Japan until about 1960 when the company closed. And this was really a great move for both companies, but as we'll see, making copies of motorcycles just wouldn't prove to be enough. Japanese companies would have to look to innovation in the motorcycle world if they were going to make an impact. The largest total production year prior to World War II in Japan was 1940, when just over 3,000 bikes were made. Many companies would be enlisted to make motorcycles during the war, but nothing even close to the scale of the Western countries. But all of this was basically moot. What did exist of a Japanese motorcycle industry prior to the war was almost entirely wiped out during the war. And then in 1945, as the war came to a close, just 127 motorcycles were produced. Even by 1950, as the industry was slowly growing, they still weren't even making 3,000 bikes a year for production. 1951, however, would mark the beginning of a sort of explosion of growth in the industry. Some 11,000 motorcycles were made in Japan, which was up almost 4 times to the previous year. But there's a bit of an untold story in the midst of this massive growth for the motorcycle industry in Japan, and it's the story of the Great Japanese Motorcycle War. As with all good wars, it starts with scooters. I don't know if that's true or not. Coming out of the war, the main producers of important goods like munitions and things like that, these companies always have to figure out what they're going to make now that the war is over. Mitsubishi and what was now called Fuji Industries, two of the main companies actively producing products for Japanese war efforts, they decided to jump into the two-wheeled segment with small displacement scooters, which were basically just copies of some of the American scooters that existed. And this accounted for much of the growth in production of two-wheeled vehicles, especially leading into the 50s. But other companies jumped on and started building scooters as well. Some were doing this as a sort of springboard into building four-wheeled vehicles. Some of the automotive companies that we see in Japan today started by making scooters and motorcycles at this point. The appetite for scooters was ripe in Japan, as it was in Italy post-war. The same appetite that, the Vespa would sort of satiate, a desire for affordable, economical transportation. And as in Italy, the scooter would be a sort of gateway for many into, getting motorcycles. These were difficult times for manufacturers, though. Necessary materials were difficult to get a hold of in Japan during the years where they were under occupation after the war. 1947 would mark an important moment for the Japanese motorcycle industry when GHQ decided to permit Japanese production of both scooters and full-sized motorcycles. Decisions made at this point in regards to vehicle licensing, road development, state-sponsored gambling on motorcycle races, and a whole bunch of other things would essentially create competition and really help weed out the sort of weaker manufacturers. And it really made for an incredibly competitive market as the 1950s were underway. Perhaps the most important change had to do with how motorcycles were categorized and how licenses were determined. So a new law made it so that 16-year-olds could now get a motorcycle license and ride a bike up to 1,500 cc's, given that they can pass their exam. And 14-year-olds could now ride a motorized bicycle without any type of license or examination. This would not only create a massive demand and boost for these types of small, lightweight motorcycles, it would also sort of harbor a love for and a culture of two-wheeled vehicles in Japan. Later laws would further this by raising the displacement available for young riders who didn't do an exam, and this new appetite for essentially motorized bicycles is the reason why we see so many companies in Japan starting with their first model as basically a motorized bicycle. Think companies like Honda and Suzuki. While the rest of the world was riding much bigger and faster motorcycles, it was again like Japan was starting from scratch with motorcycles, once again strapping engines to bicycles and sort of mirroring the early days of motorcycle development all over. As the demand for small motorcycles rose, more and more manufacturers jumped into the mix, giving their take on what a small scooter or small motorcycle could be. And it's with this model that companies like Honda and Suzuki would begin making small motorized bicycles. Yamaha would come a bit later, and obviously Kawasaki would come even later. But it's really important to understand that companies like Honda and Suzuki were really just two among many. In specific regions, manufacturers vied for space to build their machines. Hamamatsu was one of those hotspots for this, and in that region alone, the HMMA was formed in 1953, that is the Hamamatsu Motorcycle Manufacturers Association, and just to name a few, it consisted of companies like Suzuki, Kitagawa, Honda, Daiwa, Marusho, Rocket Company, Ishidzu, All Nations Motors, HM Company, Tenru, Nagamoto, Nissin Motors, Aoi Motors, Kato Iron Works, Samkyo Iron Works, Chuo Industries, and many more. Again, that's just one region, and I'm sure I did not pronounce most of these names right. But all of these companies, they were vying for their share of the market. The HMMA, that is that association, would rent out school playgrounds, and they would invite whoever wanted to come, and all the companies would bring their best iteration of what a motorcycle could be to compete in various trials, and mainly just allow people from the communities to come and ride their bikes and just see what was the best. Competition was just fostered at such a different level in this industry, really, than in any part of the world at this point. The companies who could foster an environment in their workplaces where forward progress and innovation were just absolutely paramount, these are the companies that would come out on top. Now, through the 1950s, a sort of weeding out of companies would take place. At this time, there were a few different kinds of motorcycle companies. There were those that made their motorcycles entirely in-house, that is, basically every part just developed and designed and made by the company, and these companies invested heavily in learning every aspect of what makes up the motorcycle, and they worked to make their own parts, whereas there were other companies that contracted out much of what made up their motorcycles to various other companies, even motors and transmissions and frames. And if you know anything about, for example, Honda's origins, you know that early on, Mr. Honda focused heavily on R&D and just being able to design and build their own key components. So when large companies that were essentially hubs for many different motorcycle manufacturers, like for example Yamaguchi Bicycle Manufacturing Company, when companies like that would go bankrupt, it would take out loads of other companies with it. Companies that didn't know how to build their own parts, or maybe they built parts for that company, and now they no longer had that business. That heavy dependence between companies would really prove detrimental, so even though Honda and Suzuki, even though their early motors, for example, were inferior to their competitors who were sourcing these parts in the early days, this investment in really learning how to build their own central parts is what would save them going forward. Competition would also play a key part in finding out who was the best. After the war, large motorcycle races were held in Japan, but early on, these mainly still just featured British and American motorcycles. But as the 50s moved on, Japan began to have their own races featuring Japanese motorcycles, and these races had government-sanctioned gambling as an effort to really build the economy. The Mount Fuji Ascent Race, for example, would prove an important place for companies to show their prowess. Companies like Yamaha, for example, would burst onto the scene in 1955 and then would basically win the 125cc class in this race pretty much just a year later. These large Japanese races really weeded out the competition even more. Japan was experiencing its own win on Sunday, sell on Monday, as sometimes upwards of 100,000 spectators would attend these races. Winning meant more than just glory, it really meant survival. Fans in the crowd longed for these more performance-oriented machines. This is really a spirit that is still present in Japan, and these races really help to influence the general public in moving beyond scooters to actual larger displacement motorcycles. And this graph is really awesome from this amazing book called Japan's Motorcycle Wars, and it shows this trend. Side note, I could not have made this video without this book as a resource. It's fantastic. Now, 1952 marked the peak of the number of Japanese motorcycle manufacturers, with 120 companies making bikes. By 1955, though, there were now only 73, and year after year moving forward, the number would just continue to fall drastically until there were pretty much 7, and then, through the end of the 60s, as we know, just 4. In the mid-50s, though, 3 companies really started to shine above the rest, which was Honda, Suzuki, and Yamaha. Whether on the racetrack or in dealer showrooms, these companies started to pull ahead of everyone else when it came to making the best, most reliable, highest performing motorcycles that you could buy in Japan. They were winning on the track, they were getting all the media attention, and quickly, they were pretty much it. Kawasaki would come later in the early 60s to round out the big four, and that happened through their partnership with Maguro. Now, initial attempts at exporting bikes were minimal for these companies, but quickly the total production numbers ballooned from around 100,000 in 1953 to 1 million in 1960, in part thanks to Honda and, their little cub. But how is it that these specific companies, the companies that we know of today, how are they able to stand out? What was it about Honda and Suzuki and Yamaha and Kawasaki that specifically made them able to dominate racing and ultimately the production of sophisticated, larger displacement bikes? How did they progress so fast? In just a matter of a year in the case of Yamaha, to go from making, basically little bicycles with motors strapped to them to full-blown motorcycles. I mean, these manufacturers often made more progress in just a few years than the big British and American companies did in decades. Now, that amazing book by Jeffrey W. Alexander on the motorcycle wars in Japan points out that the origin of these companies, and especially Honda, is rarely looked at in its correct historical context, and often virtually no time is given to how these entrepreneurs, people like Soichiro Honda, actually accomplished what they did. The key to understanding their success is understanding what they were doing before they started making motorcycles. This didn't just happen in a vacuum. Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, and later Kawasaki, they all had previous experience during the war, both in mass production, but also in engineering, management, basically everything that was needed to develop a mechanical product like a motorcycle. These companies all took part in the production for Japan's wartime regime, and that meant that they all understood things like the value of automated production systems. These companies had experience building, designing, managing, innovating. It wasn't, zero to domination like many present it. But it is true that companies like Honda took massive risks and really bet heavily on themselves through the 50s and 60s multiple times. The company would be put on the line in various ways that many motorcycle manufacturers were just unwilling to do, and that's how Honda became as dominant as it is. Now, though it's true that these four companies were able to make their bikes stand out, the internal workings within Japan through the 50s and 60s is beyond just, simply making the best product. Loads of companies had great, interesting, unique offerings beyond just Honda, Yamaha, and Suzuki and Kawasaki. A full-blown war was taking place between these manufacturers, which included corporate espionage like we see with, a certain brand and their two-stroke development, to just betrayal within and between companies. As things heated up through the 1950s, in an attempt to secure their own place in the market, many of the motorcycle manufacturers made gentlemen's agreements with each other, stuff like, I'll make 250s, you make 125s, and let's not encroach on each other's models or undercut each other's prices. That kind of stuff. Sadly, these companies soon found out the reality of business. It's war. While some lead business figures held on to traditional Japanese values, things like loyalty in their business practices, others did what was necessary to survive, and often the good guys lost. One story of betrayal features IMC, which is Ito Motor Company, and Tohatsu Motor Company. And IMC designed an engine using Tohatsu's leftover engine materials, and Tohatsu agreed not to make their own engine out of the materials. But as you can probably guess, that agreement was broken, so IMC was forced to find another engine, and they made another gentleman's agreement with a company called Mizuho Motors, who agreed that they would provide a 250cc engine for IMC, and that they wouldn't make that 250 for their own motorcycles. Now, not long after, IMC would be shocked to see the Mizuho 250 hit the market. Just a blatant betrayal in an attempt to get ahead. IMC stuck to their values throughout their whole company history, and of course they didn't survive. Now, there were even more factors. Manufacturers often had tumultuous relationships with dealers. Sometimes the more ruthless companies got ahead. Doing business was tough in post-war Japan. Just writing a check was difficult and often required multiple steps. The dealers had to buy the motorcycles direct from manufacturers. Of course, many of them didn't have the cash to just buy loads of stock, so they would make promissory notes. Many dealers were essentially writing bad checks, and ultimately, until Honda took control of their own dealer network, some companies were losing millions. All this to say that it was so much more than just making the fastest or most reliable or most durable motorcycles. It was management, it was production, it was business practices, leadership, dealer relationships. As the hundreds of motorcycle companies in Japan dwindled down to less than 10, those that remained were really stronger for it. I think that the world was shocked when companies like Honda and Suzuki showed up in the West and just took over. In their mind, out of nowhere. It wasn't just that the bikes were good. It was that these companies knew how to do everything. They knew how to build dealer networks. They knew how to inspire partners. They understood what it took to study a market and build a product that fit. Companies like Honda knew how to make an advertising campaign that tapped into something different in the general public, and they were better at it than the companies that had been in those markets for forever. These companies came to completely dominate the motorcycle industry, taking down the British and almost American markets. And what the world didn't understand, and I think even today often fails to recognize, was that the toughest competition was in many ways behind them. These companies were so good already because they had to be to survive. The intense competition from within Japan through the 50s and 60s meant that the only companies that would come out alive would be the companies that understood every single aspect of motorcycle manufacturing and design and development to such a degree nobody would be able to stop them. And of course, that's exactly what would happen. By the time little Hondas and Suzukis and Yamahas and Kawasaki's were hitting the American and European shores, these companies had everything that they needed to innovate rapidly, to take all the money brought in from bikes like the Honda Cub and invest it all into developing the best and fastest motorcycles, both for the track and for the road. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this sort of random part of motorcycle history that isn't talked about a lot. Thanks for watching, and yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.